say, hey, what a wonderful kind of day. If you could learn to work and play and get along with each other.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Did you grow up watching Arthur on PBS, or do your kids watch today? The beloved children's series ends next year after 25 years on air and online. Coming up, we talk about the impact of children's programming, and we hear from one of the voice actors who played DW, Arthur's sister. First, we're taking a break from the news to talk about entertainment, specifically what shows we should check out this fall. Who better to ask than Eric Deggan, NPR's TV critic. Eric is joining us now on Zoom. Eric, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure and so fun to hear from you when you're on. And our listeners can join too. Is there a show that you're looking forward to watching this fall, or one that's binge-worthy? 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page and find us on Twitter at Where We Live. When I was growing up, Eric, it was a big deal to see in the fall what the big three networks were going to premiere, but now we have so many more choices out there.
You're dating yourself with that big three networks.
I know, right? I noticed you were silent, Eric.
Yes, youngsters. There was a time when there were only about 4 networks and then a few UHF stations that we could watch. But yeah, we're in a point now where all of the major media companies are aligning themselves to feed material to their streaming services, because that's what the industry is interested in now. So the result of that for consumers is that you just have this massive deluge of material coming at you every week on several different streaming services. From my perspective, there's never been a better time to be a fan of television, but it can be a lot. So I'm here to help.
So speaking of back in the day, I remember watching Wonder Years, and now there's a Wonder Years reboot. Tell us about it.
I know. So, and this isn't necessarily a new concept. ABC tried to reboot the film Uncle Buck as a series with Black characters. So the Wonder Years, they're rebooting the Wonder Years with Black characters. But the difference is that this has some thought behind it. And I think it's a very well done. I've only seen the pilot, but I think it's a very well done idea, which is to say that the original Wonder Years with Fred Savage was kind of the story of baby boomers in their youth, right? Looking back and seeing all the things, all the formative things that made sort of that generation what it is. And now we have a chance to tell a story that's similar, but tell it about a Black family in 1968 in Alabama. So the lead character is 12 years old in 1968 in Alabama. The voice that we hear that narrates everything is Don Cheadle, who's an amazing actor. He's really good at, he's very funny, but he can get serious when he needs to. And he's authoritative enough and recognizable enough that you pay attention when he's talking. And Dule Hill, who folks may remember from The West Wing and Psych, plays the character's dad, who's a music professor and a musician who just happens to have an R&B hit at the time that the series starts. And I really enjoy watching this because you get a look at what it's like to grow up Black. You get a look at what Black culture is like in an upwardly mobile Black family at that time. I know that's a pivotal year. So I'm sure they're going to talk about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights struggle and the riots that were going on in certain cities over that struggle. But it's also a story just about a kid who has a crush on a girl in his class, and he wants her to notice him. So it's a great little combination of storylines.
And that's out of ABC?
Yes, that's on ABC.
Now, speaking of the streaming services, on Hulu, Dopesick, which sounds really timely. I remember talking to the journalist Beth Macy when her book came out of the same name, Dopesick. Can you tell us about this series?
So Dopesick is another really interesting. It's another really interesting series that does a couple things at once. On the surface, what it's doing is it's outlining how the opioid crisis came to overtake America, and particularly how it came to cripple working class mostly white communities in rural or undeveloped areas. So Michael Keaton is brilliant as this doctor who's working in a small mining town. He loves his job. He loves the people that he's taking care of, but he's kind of pushed and convinced into prescribing OxyContin for less major injuries. There was a time when opioids were only used to treat people who were kind of at the end of life or had really severe medical conditions. But the trick about OxyContin was that the company that made it told doctors that it wasn't addictive and encouraged them to prescribe it for less severe injuries, back pain, back injuries, things like that. So Michael Keaton plays this doctor who cares so much about his patients, and he's sort of pushed into prescribing this drug to them. Of course, it works for a while, but then people get addicted. And prosecutors start to notice this wave of crime going throughout their communities that starts to take hold as more and more people get addicted to these prescription drugs. And then they also show how Richard Sackler, who at the time was running Purdue Pharma, was the series depicts that character pushing the company to convince doctors to prescribe this drug more and more and more so they can make more money based on not a lot of evidence. And it turns out that all these claims about it not being addictive, of course, were not true. It not only is a great depiction of all the different elements of the opioid crisis and how it overtook America, it's also a really good depiction of working class white America and these towns that are struggling. We saw so many people trying to understand in the wake of the success of Donald Trump, why were people so upset about America and where America was going? This series tells that story in addition to telling a larger story about the opioid crisis.
You've hooked us with that description, Eric. I wanted to play just a clip from the trailer of Dope Sick on Hulu.
People all across this great nation are in pain. They have hard lives.
Are you still sore?
I can't work here no more.
It'll be all right.
And we have the cure. This new miracle drug, OxyContin. You will be the largest sales force in pharmaceutical history. Make your doctors feel special. Take them to expensive dinners. Bribe the receptionist with a mani-pedi. Whatever it takes to win their trust. Your most effective talking point are these magic words.
Less than 1% of people get addicted to OxyContin.
That's not possible.
And Eric, in that trailer, we hear the voice of Michael Keaton. What are some other big name actors that are in this series?
Rosario Dawson plays one of the prosecutors who was trying really hard to develop a case against Purdue Pharma for what it was doing. But what sort of stands out here is the work of some actors who are not as well known. This guy named Michael Stuhlbarg, who people would know if they saw his face. He played the crime boss in Your Honor, the Showtime series. He played a funny alien in Men in Black 3. He played a bad guy in Boardwalk Empire. Here he is amazing as Richard Sackler, the head of Purdue Pharma, who was for many years just focused like a laser on the idea that these pain medications could be prescribed for a wider range of illnesses, and in that way it would make the company so much more money. And Caitlin Dever, who a lot of people may know, she was on shows like Justified. She's been in some great movies. She does a great job playing this young girl who works in the mines and injures her back and winds up becoming addicted to OxyContin. And so these stories, while they're also individual stories, they're about a larger tapestry of people who were struggling with this addiction as it was sweeping across the nation. And I think if you really want to understand like the progression of how it came to hobble America, this is a great series for that.
And again, based on the book Dope Sick by journalist Beth Macy, I want to tweet out a link to our conversation with her just a couple of years ago when that book came out. You're hearing on Zoom today Eric Deggans, NPR's TV Critic as we talk about what's coming up this fall, shows to watch that are binge-worthy. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And so let's talk about Apple TV Plus. Any shows that you feel like should be on our listeners' watch list?
Well, I'll talk about two shows. One, because one show that they're sure to be hearing a lot about is The Morning Show, which is it's sort of showcase drama featuring Jennifer Aniston and Reese Witherspoon and Steve Carell, and it's about these people who host this fictionalized morning show. I'm not that big a fan of this series, but I recognize that a lot of people will be talking about it, and it's going to drop its first episodes tomorrow. It's going to pick up with this idea that we saw Jennifer Aniston's character kind of quit the business at the end of the first season, spoiler alert, and they figure out a way to rope her back into hosting the morning show. And they at the last minute, they kind of rewrote some of the scripts to include the COVID crisis. So you also see them trying to cover the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So that's something that people are going to be hearing a lot about. I'm not as big a fan of that show as some people are, but I know people will be hearing about it. The other Apple TV Plus show that I'm really interested in is called Foundation, and it's based on this book series that was written by the legendary science fiction writer Isaac Asimov. And anybody who knows that book series, it's very sprawling. It's about this huge galactic empire where a scientist uses math to prove that the empire is going to fall into ruin. And he's trying to convince the empire to do things that will shorten the amount of chaos that comes after the empire ends. And nobody wants to believe him. Now, this was a sprawling book series, and I can't, I've seen several episodes of this. It's very well done, but I just can't imagine taking that huge series of books and compressing it into even a limited series. But somehow they managed to come up with a great storyline that mimics a lot of the things in the books, but adds a lot of new material. It was put together by David S. Goyer, who people might remember. He's written superhero movies like Batman Begins and Man of Steel. And here they use a lot of cutting edge special effects to tell this story about a huge empire that is floundering because it has a lot of people who have lost faith in science. And how timely a story could that be? And the funny thing is, like, I went back and I reread the first book in the Foundation series before I watched these episodes, and it feels like that book could have been written yesterday in terms of talking about anti-science, talking about the ways in which people lose faith in science and how that can be a critical problem for society if they lose sight of the scientific method and the ways in which science can enrich our lives. So I think this is a great story. And if you like a science fiction yarn, you'll probably enjoy it too. But it is very complicated. So spend some time watching very closely.
I wanted to ask you about the return of American Crime Story impeachment. Here's a clip.
I'm kind of in something.
And yet you feel lonely.
Yes, affirmative.
Well, that's no good. Tell me about him.
It's just he's unavailable.
Someone long distance. Someone from work. Someone important. Is that why they sent you here?
And so in that clip, you're hearing characters playing Monica Lewinsky and Linda Tripp. But what's your take, Eric? Is this worth a watch?
Yeah, I think it is. I enjoyed it. And, I was somebody who was a journalist when a lot of this went down, and I covered the media end of it. So I thought I knew the story very well. But one thing I didn't know quite so well was the relationship between Linda Tripp and Monica Lewinsky and how that fed into what eventually happened and what the public came to learn about the affair between Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. There's a lot of great performances here, even amongst, the supporting characters. But I think Clive Owen, the British actor, does a great job as Bill Clinton. He plays him as He doesn't play him as a cartoon. He doesn't exaggerate the Southern accent. You get a sense of him more as a man than a cartoon, which is a really smart choice. And Sarah Paulson is amazing as Linda Tripp. She does a great job, not only inhabiting this character that a lot of people think they know, but making her empathetic and humanizing her, even while showing her doing things that are reprehensible. Like, they don't pull punches in showing how unlikable Linda Tripp was and why so many people who worked with her couldn't stand her, and how she betrayed Monica Lewinsky by secretly taping their phone conversations and then turning those phone conversations over to investigators. But Sarah Paulson inhabits her as a person, so you still get a sense about why she might have made those choices. And you have a little bit, I mean, there's a scene where she is watching Saturday Night Live with her grown children, and John Goodman, the big beefy male actor, is playing her. And she wasn't expecting it, and you see the hurt in the character's face. And even though you know that Linda Tripp has done some terrible things, you kind of feel for her in that moment. And it's a great way of talking about how we all cracked all these thoughtless jokes about Lewinsky and Tripp and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton without realizing that there were human beings on the other end of those jokes, and that they could have a deadly sting.
Let's talk about some binge-worthy shows that really focus on privilege. Everyone's been talking about the Netflix's The Chair. There's also HBO's White Lotus. Which one do you want to start with first, Eric?
We could talk about The Chair. The Chair is a Netflix series starring Sandra Oh that's about a woman of color who winds up taking over as dean of a literature department in a college. And she winds up having to manage all these old, out-of-touch professors who are offering these courses that the kids aren't that interested in. And she also has a male professor under her who's working under her, who she also has romantic feelings for. He's floundering after his wife died. And he's also not living up to his potential as a teacher. And, as somebody who teaches myself, I teach as an adjunct at Duke University, like, so much of what they depict about academia is so on point. So I really enjoyed that. Now, The White Lotus was sort of I think it was the streaming series of the summer. A lot of people talked about it. It's about all these rich folks who go to a resort in Hawaii, and they have all of these experiences sort of rooted to the dysfunction that's connected to how they live and how they think about things. A lot of people liked it. I have to say, I am not one of those people. I really, I had a problem with the eventual message of the series. Again, spoiler alert, at the end of the series, these rich people are kind of exploring how dysfunctional how they feel their lives aren't working, or how dysfunctional their lives are, or problems in their lives. But in the end, they don't really change their behavior that much. And in the end, the people who pay the price for their problems are the people who don't have money and power, who are around them. And for me, I felt like a lot of the wealthy characters were kind of cliches that I had seen before in other productions, but the working class people who were part of the stories were much more interesting, much more authentic, but we spent less time with them, and they all wound up kind of poorer for the experience of having interconnected with these wealthy people. I felt the ultimate message of the show was not something I wanted to encourage or wanted to spend 8 episodes with, but a lot of people liked it. So, check it out and decide for yourself. Most certainly. The great thing about today's media environment is that there's so many high quality shows that, you can find things that resonate with you and they might not resonate with someone else. And even criticisms can give you a sense of how a show that you might like might be something that you'd want to check out. So certainly check it out. But I was not a big fan. I do think that one show that we should also mention that people are looking forward to is the 3rd season of Succession on HBO. You talk about rich people. This is a show about a very dysfunctional family that runs a media company. And it's picking up right after a cliffhanger. Again, spoiler alert, one of the siblings did something that might threaten the patriarch's control of the company, and the show is going to pick up right after that, and you have a sense that you're going to see this conflict between one of the kids and the patriarch of the family, and I can't wait to see it pick up. This new season was delayed by COVID, but in October we're going to finally get to see the third season of Succession.
Nice. And I know Eric Deggan's NPR's TV critic, NPR.org, just published its fall TV preview. So we're going to make sure that we tweet out a link to that. So many more recommendations from you. Before we let you go, coming up, we're going to be talking about the children's television series Arthur ending after 25 years. What's your take? Is this something that your kids watched?
This is definitely something that my kids watched. And, 3 of my 4 kids are completely grown and out of the house and even out of college. So that lets you know how long ago they watched it. One thing that I would say is that even though a show stops making new episodes, that doesn't mean that the show is going to disappear. I mean, people will still be able to see Arthur, and there's going to be 25 years of this show that people can see. It is unfortunate that they won't be making new episodes because one of the things that I liked about Arthur is that it occasionally talked about really contemporary subjects, lesbian parents, same-sex marriage. It helped kids process things that were happening in modern life in a very gentle and welcoming and really wholesome kind of way. And I think that's what you lose when you stop making new episodes, because they're not able to talk about the new things that we're encountering in life that kids may need to learn how to process. But in a sort of glass half full kind of attitude, we can at least celebrate the fact that we have so many seasons of this wonderful show that generations of children will find and be able to experience. They can start watching the first season, and by the time they get to the end, they'll have aged out of the show anyway. So at least we can say that.
Eric Deggans again, NPR's TV critic. So fun to hear from you, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Up next, we talk about the wonderful kind of days in the world of the very popular Aardvark. Arthur, the animated children's series on PBS, will end next year after 25 years. Did you watch Arthur growing up? Do your kids watch it today? You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Where are my Arthur fans? We want to hear from you as we talk about the public television series centered on an aardvark, his family, and other animal friends. Its final season ends next year after 25 years on television. I know my daughter watches it on the PBS app on her tablet. You can join us whether you watched Arthur or your kids watched the show today. Here's the number, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. Joining us now on Zoom is Ginger Brown. She's a children's television producer, a professor at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, and she was a producer and executive producer at Sesame Street for 25 years. Ginger, welcome to our show.
Thanks for inviting me to be on your show, Lucy.
So you know how powerful and impactful children's programming can be. When we talk about Arthur, tell us a little bit about why this show lasted as long as it did and why it had such an impact.
Well, I think it lasted as long as it did because people really loved to spend time with the characters, and in part because the writing was just so good. You know, it appealed both to kids and to their parents, and it managed to stay attuned to what are the current issues of children. It was also, it's also aware of itself. Arthur, talks to camera and sets up what's going to happen over an episode. So I think that there's a little bit of an irreverence there, even though the characters are just really likable. in addition to that, the writing is great. And I think that WGBH, the executive producer there, Carol Greenwald, who was a creator, and PBS really worked hard to, continue to make it viable on the PBS network.
Mark Brown was who wrote the original Arthur books and also illustrated. When we think about when children watch characters in a show and they're animals, does that help connect children to them, that no matter what they look like or where they're from or what race they are, maybe they see these characters on this animated show and they can connect with them? Is that part of it?
I think it's part of it. It's part of what keeps it evergreen. And as Eric said earlier, there's 25 years of this, 249 episodes, and it has just resonated for that whole time. And you can watch season 1 today and still have it be as fresh as it was 25 years ago. In terms of the characters and the anthropomorphizing of aardvarks and bears and monkeys and rats and bunnies, it just is a very diverse cast. And I think that children, the core audience is 48 years old, they can see themselves in one of those characters without those characters actually being, human and representative of humans. I think it's much more inclusive.
I wanted to talk more about some of the topics that the Arthur series tackled. Let's first play a clip. This is very timely as we are living still in this pandemic, where character Francine is teaching Muffy the importance of mask wearing. Let's hear it.
If you're going out in public, you 100% need a mask. But why? I'm not sick, and I don't like how they look. First of all, you can be sick and not know it. You can have the virus and feel totally fine. Second, without a mask, you could spread it to someone who will get really sick. Like Buster, who has asthma, or Mrs. McGrady, who had cancer, or your grandparents, or someone you don't even know. But shouldn't they wear the masks? Of course, but it doesn't help if you're sick and you don't wear one. The only way to keep everyone safe is to wear a mask. But they make my nose sweaty. If we all do our part, we can get rid of this virus. And they fog up my sunglasses. Just think of all the people who look up to you. Your fans. You're right. I am such a role model. Daddy, I'm going to need a mask before we go out. Could you possibly locate some sort of...
I took the liberty of having some made. Hand-dyed and embroidered. Only the finest for you, Muffin.
Ooh, Trey chic.
Ginger, it sounds like this is a much-watch episode for some adults, right?
Yeah, it's fantastic. I love the way that the writers took her from being resistant to being a mentor and a model. That's so empowering for kids.
Let's talk more about some of the topics that Arthur has taken on over the years. Some other controversial topics at times, too.
Yeah. So, Arthur took on day-to-day and continues to take on day-to-day children's concerns like first day of school and bullying and nosebleeds. But over the years, they've also tackled diabetes and dyslexia, cancer and autism, and they've managed to do it in a really smart and appealing way.
And it's interesting that what we heard earlier from Eric too, and this idea that it speaks to children, but it's also something that adults are sitting there watching as well, and it can start a conversation at home, Ginger.
Yes, it can start a conversation, and it's a really wonderful tool for parents who want to start a conversation, especially if their 4 to 8 year old or slightly older kid is wondering about a topic that you're not really sure how to open up the discussion. Arthur's there.
Yeah, and Eric had mentioned featuring gay and lesbian couples on the program and how it was trailblazing. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, Mr. Ratburn gets married. One thing that I do want to bring up at this point is a lot of Arthur is problem solving. And when Mr. Ratburn marries his partner. Of course, they get it all wrong until the very end, and then it's not a big deal. I think it's really wonderful, and kudos to GBH and PBS for broaching some of these subjects that may or may not be easy for families, but are important for kids to hear and to see and to parse.
I mentioned that you were an executive producer and producer at Sesame Street for more than 25 years. And so when you're talking about, issues that can be difficult, and maybe not everyone agrees with that being presented on a children's program, what kind of conversations are happening behind the scenes? And how do shows like Arthur confront those critiques, and because we know even with mask wearing, how divisive that has become in our country.
Well, I can tell you have to stay true to your brand, and you have to know that kids are sponges, and if you can give them the right information, then they're going to learn, and they're much less judgmental than we adults are, and have less of an opinion about some simple things like mask wearing. And so I think that is what Arthur's done, and that's always what Sesame Street has done. And if it's the right information, then you can really stand behind it. Certainly, I don't know if Arthur had as much pushback as Sesame has for some of the things that it has modeled. In South Africa, there's an HIV positive Muppet, and that caused a big stir in the United States for some reason. But Arthur does have one banned episode that was about Vermont. It was actually, it's not Arthur, it's Postcards from Buster, about Vermont and a same-sex couple. And if you look at it, you have to wonder why, but it just, I guess, struck the critics the wrong way.
You're hearing Ginger Brown here on Where We Live. She's on Zoom with us, a children's television producer, professor at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Again, she was a producer and executive producer at Sesame Street for 25 years. We're talking with her as we focus on Arthur, which was, I think, now the longest running animated series on television, ending next year after 25 years. You can join us if you've watched Arthur. Is there an episode that stood out to you when you were a child, or even one that you watch with your kids today? The number 888-720-9677. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, Ginger will stay with us, and we're going to hear from a Canadian voice actor who was one of the voices of DW, Arthur's sister. Back after a short break. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about Arthur, the lovable Aardvark, in the popular kids show on PBS. Next year will be its final season. It's the longest running animated series in television history, 25 years. With us on Zoom, Ginger Brown, a children's television producer and professor at NYU, and she worked on Sesame Street for many years. And joining us now is a voice that was part of the Arthur series, Jason Szwimer, podcast host of Finding DW, and he was a voice of DW on Arthur from 2002 to 2006. For people who haven't watched the show, DW is Arthur's little sister. Jason, welcome.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for having me. And Ginger, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So nice to hear from you, Jason. And I mentioned that you're a Canadian voice actor. So how did you land the role of DW?
I was just in the right place at the right time. My mom has a long commute to work and heard an open casting call to try to find talent to be voices on Arthur. And she thought to herself, well, I have an exuberant, loud child who might be interested in this sort of thing. And so we just called in, and I got cast in the room. My voice just happened to be what they were looking for.
And so from 2002 to 2006, you were DW.
Yes, I was. Yeah.
What was that like?
I was great. I mean, I was the type of student where, I wasn't super, I was always kind of daydreaming and wasn't always the most attentive student as I could be. So I was looking for excuses to get out of class. So I was excited to be able to leave early, to be able to go and record. It was this super fun after school activity that I got to do that I look back on fondly.
I mentioned you're also the podcast host of Finding DW. So you were one of 8 boys who at one time were the voice.
Yeah, that's right. And
chosen to play. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think I might have lost you there for a moment. So my podcast is all about how recently I learned that DW had only been played by male voice actors. And I decided it would be fun to try to track them all down, to talk to them about the experience and to maybe learn something along the way.
I love that. And I listened to one of your episodes this morning, really well done, where you actually talked with Mark Brown, who was the creator of Arthur, about his idea. But tell me a little bit more, like, why is this character a 4-year-old girl, and why has it been played by boys?
I think, there's a tradition in cartoon casting where, the character you see in the cartoon isn't necessarily voiced by the same gendered actor or even the same age. I mean, for example, the Rugrats are voiced by women, or DW's voiced by young boys. I think it's pretty common. And I think that when they were originally casting the show, the person they ended up going with happened to be a talented former voice actor named Michael Callows. And then, the nature of that is such that, as these boys would go through puberty, they would look for a voice match to replace that person. And while they did audition girls to play the part, I think they just kept casting guys because it sounded closest to Michael's performance.
Were you sad when your time ended?
Yes and no. I think at the time I'd received so much attention that it was actually quite overwhelming. It was sort of difficult for me to find interests outside of acting and sort of engage with people on a regular level, because as you can imagine, the show was so popular when I got on the show in season 7. So people in my elementary school and high school were, treating me like I was this celebrity. And, that's something I'm still trying to unpack, and part of the reason why I decided to start this podcast at all.
Again, we're hearing Jason Szwimer, podcast host of Finding DW. He was the voice of DW, Arthur's little sister, from 2002 to 2006. You can join us as we talk about the legacy of this animated series on PBS, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Michael's calling in. Michael, what did you want to share?
Hi, this is of a parent. I'm now 60, so my kids are young adults, but children's TV was a big part of my life as they were kids. And what I saw first about Arthur, I always thought it was wonderfully done. The writing was strong, good characters, excellent artwork. But they all 3 of them in their own stage outgrew Arthur, I would say, by like 2nd or 3rd grade. And that, to me, it seems a natural progression to move away from, there's a certain amount of preachiness to Arthur, where you're being told, the right way to do things and to consider moral questions. But Arthur was very much succeeded by SpongeBob, which was much more anarchic and much more irreverent, and certainly didn't have a pedantic attitude toward viewers. So, and then after SpongeBob, sadly with our son, he gravitated to South Park. But I almost feel, that when you speak about aging out of a show, that there is this progression from the comfort of a world of strong values and admirable characters to getting more and more I don't know, irreverent might be the adjective.
Well, I loved hearing from you, Michael. Thank you for calling into the show. Ginger Brown, you're still with us. How do you respond to Michael's comments?
Well, I have a couple things. First of all, it's really wonderful. It sounds like his kids were exactly the sweet spot, 4 to 8 year old kids watching the show. I do think that any educational television show, especially the ones on PBS, they're based on a curriculum. And, Arthur certainly was about literacies, both social emotional literacies and basic literacy, like learning to read and problem solving. And when you work that way as a producer or a writer, you do want to hit whatever the thing is, that piece is supposed to be at, like very literally. And that at times can sound a little preachy on Arthur, but it's fleeting and it's very clear for kids who, when they're 4-year-old, kids are pretty concrete. You really have to say exactly what you want to tell them in addition to showing it to them and telling them a story about it. So I don't disagree with him, but I think it serves a purpose, and it's part of why this show is so popular.
Jason Szwimer, we were talking with you about what it was like to be a voice on this series for several years. Have you rewatched some episodes where you are voicing DW? What's that like to hear and watch today as an adult?
It's very surreal. I mean, when I started on the show, I kind of stopped watching. I feel like I just saw how the sauce was made, and then I just moved on to other shows. So I've been watching more Arthur now than I ever have in my whole life, and just sort of falling in love with the show and kind of discovering why people are so excited when they find out that I was DW,
I want to play a clip where we hear you, Jason Szwimer. Here it is.
How are we going to do Irish step dancing if you can't even do tap?
It's not my fault. It's the sneakers. These tacks I put on the sole don't make a good sound.
But you didn't do any of the moves. Didn't you learn anything from those index cards I gave you?
Of course not. I can't read.
That's you saying, of course not, I can't read, Jason.
Yeah, that's me. That's me acting alongside a very talented voice actor named Bruce Dinsmore, who I had a chance to speak with for my podcast.
Wonderful. Again, that podcast called Finding DW. You're the podcast host, and you spoke to the other voices as well as Mark Brown. We'll be sure to tweet out a link. I wanted to take another call from a listener. Julia is calling in from Trumbull. Hi, Julia.
Hi there. How are you?
Doing well. What did you want to share?
Okay. I have 2 daughters, and they're 23 and 27 now. But when they were much younger, Arthur was really one of our favorite shows. I think we found the show before we even found the books. And initially, I think what drew me as a mom to the show was the gentleness of Arthur, that he was a boy who, I guess this was before the term toxic masculinity existed, but I really liked that character. But as my daughters got a little older, DW was such a spunky girl, and she was one of later we had Angelica, who was awful but also pretty spunky, and Junie B. Jones, and DW was just great. She had so much life and energy, and we even had a DW birthday party one year for one of my girls. She wanted it, and there was another when one of my daughters turned 6. A boy in her class had the same birthday, and so we read there's an Arthur book where 2 characters have the same birthday. So they were really formative in my kids' growing up years.
Well, thank you, Julia, for sharing that with us. Jason, did you want to respond to what the caller shared?
Just that I love hearing stories like that. It makes me feel very proud.
You'd said earlier that, the fact that you're a part of this show and now that it's ending, and how people respond to you when they hear that for several years you were the voice of DW. So what has that been like to unpack?
It's I'm a young person trying to figure out my life and my creative career, and so this project was just something that I felt really compelled to do, and I'm so fortunate that I had the time to do so. It's been so amazing to connect with people like the previous caller or people reaching out to me over DM or Twitter, I've had people message me about what I'm doing or how much Arthur's meant to them that have just been really sweet and kind of made me cry. And I don't know, it's just been a really wonderful project to work on. And it's been so great to connect with people and to share, my love for the show and to give something back to this show that's ending.
Right. And when you spoke to the other people who were the voices of DW, did they have a similar experience as you?
Yeah. I mean, what I learned was that, we all had this big thing happen to us when we were kids, but we all kind of reacted to it differently. And, from the first former voice of DW who went on to now work as a life coach to one who works in the auto industry, to some of us who went on to be actors. I mean, it's really fascinating to see sort of how we all reacted to this shared experience.
Ginger Brown, you're still with us, and I wanted to ask you before we end, we've got about 3 minutes or so, when we think about how children consume media, they're not watching PBS on the television at home, but on a tablet, and how that has changed programming today.
Well, I mean, I'm so glad that you brought that up. And that's part of, I guess, the point of this conversation today is that even though Arthur is not going to be produced on a regular basis anymore, it's still going to be seen often. Arthur's not going away. And it will, I'm sure, be part of WGBH's on-demand and digital-first content. If you look at at the Arthur website, there's just a whole lot of games and fun things to do, and the episodes are there. And it makes this wonderful show, available to kids of all ages on phones and on tablets and at home and probably streaming. I know there's, the YouTube Children's Channel is building some Arthur content into it. So, kids access screens everywhere, and I have a feeling that Arthur will continue to be really popular.
And that's a good thing to hear. And I also love the fact, Ginger, that schools are able to access these episodes, online and use them using learning modules. I know Sesame Street is very big on that.
Yes. There's a lot of outreach that happens with these early learning children's television shows, both animated and live action and Muppet based. And it's a wonderful way to support both schools and for some of us who have had kids at home for the last year and a half, to be able to provide them with content that you can also have some kind of support to reinforce what the lessons are as a parent or a teacher.
Yes, as a parent of 2 children, PBS Kids app was a godsend in the first few months of this lockdown. So I appreciate it as my personal experience. But Ginger Brown, what a pleasure to hear from you and to hear a little bit about your career. A longtime producer and executive producer of Sesame Street. Now you're a professor at NYU. And it's good to hear your perspective, Ginger. Thank you for coming on today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And Jason Szwimer was here, the voice of DW, Arthur's little sister from 2002 to 2006. He's got a great podcast, host of Finding DW, where he talks to other people who played DW through the years. And what a lovely conversation you had with Mark Brown, the original creator of Arthur. I encourage listeners to check that out. Thank you, Jason, for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Tess Terrible produced today's show, also an Arthur fan. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. You can listen to Where We Live anytime. Just download us on your favorite podcast app. We'll be back tomorrow.